Hello and good morning. First of all, I wanted to thank my mentor, Dr. Verba, and all of you for being here supporting us, the students. My research explored how Mexican Americans are remembered during the World War II era, more specifically how Mexican Americans were portrayed or depicted by the United States in the media. As I shared with others that I plan to research how they were viewed and remembered during this era, I actually led me to my thesis, which was for most people, when they connected Mexican Americans, they connected it during the World War II era to either the Sipi Lagoon case of 1942 or the Zoot Suit riots of 1943. I therefore concluded that it was the involvement in both of these events that made Mexican Americans visible, and as a consequence casted a shadow over the Mexican American soldier and their involvement in World War II, thus making them invisible. In 2007, documentary filmmaker Ken Burns produced a film titled The War, in which he failed to mention the participation and contribution of Mexican Americans in World War II. This is a perfect example of how even today Mexican Americans, their participation in World War II is made invisible. On August 3rd, 1942, the Los Angeles Times printed an article about the death of 22-year-old Jose Diaz, who had been found beaten to death at a party at the Williams Ranch. The article goes on to mention that at a local swimming pool in Baldwin Park, 5 boys were attacked by 11 gangsters. The 11 youths were taken into custody and their names were released, all of whom were of Mexican descent. The incident will later be known as the Sipi Lagoon case. On August 3rd, in 1942, the Los Angeles Times printed an article, historian Carrie McWilliams wrote that the press in Los Angeles began printing stories of Mexican crime and delinquency. They were building anti-Mexican sentiment with the incidents that had occurred in the spring of 1942. In newspaper articles, the Mexican American youth were now being described as, quote, hoodlums. Also, the trial publicity was very much anti-Mexican. Historian David G. Gutierrez wrote that racial stereotypes were reinforced by the reportage of local Los Angeles newspapers, like the Times and Herald Express, where they headlined stories about marauding Latin gangs and roving wolf packs. The judge ordered that the defendants were not allowed to cut their hair or change into clean clothing during the trial. Historian Richard Griswold del Castillo wrote that the Zoot Suit riots started on June 3rd, 1943, when servicemen and sailors went into Los Angeles looking for young Mexican Americans wearing zoot suits. Over the next few nights, Mexican Americans were dragged out of their cars, buses, and theaters. They were beaten and stripped from their clothing. Starting on June 7th and lasting about 1 week, Mexican Americans were making the front page of the LA Times as, quote, zooters and zoot suiters. Historian Mauricio Masson stated that the, quote, imaginary exploits of zoot suiters received more news coverage than the combat exploits of Mexican American Medal of Honor winners, end quote. Mexican Americans were made invisible in 2 ways. First, they were registered as, quote, white or, quote, Caucasian upon enlisting the military. Federal and state law said Mexican Americans were white, and by war years, the U.S. Census Bureau officially categorized them as such. Unlike African Americans, Mexican Americans were not legally segregated in the military. Secondly, their actions and sacrifices not only were overlooked by the press and media of that time, but by historians as well. On October 25th, 1945, the Los Angeles Times ran a story about 25 local men, Mexican descent, who were honoring a, quote, Mexican youth who destroyed a Japanese machine gun nest at the cost of his life. They had an American Legion post named in his honor. This, quote, Mexican youth was Private Jose Martinez, who had also received the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously. The article refers to Private Martinez as a Mexican youth when it could have said a Mexican American youth or even a youth of Mexican descent, like it had used to describe the 25 men who were honoring him. Private Jose Martinez was born in Taos, New Mexico, and came from a long line of American-born, Spanish-speaking ancestors. The fact that this brave soldier died for his country in May of 1943, just 2 months before the notorious Zoot Suit riots took place, and was not mentioned in the newspaper until 1945, and as simply a Mexican youth, is evidence of the invisibility of Mexican American soldiers in the press. Another instance where Mexican-American soldiers were invisible in the press was in an article printed in the Los Angeles Times on January 9, 1944, titled, "Indian Jungle Fighters Crack Japs' Raleigh Lines." The article stated that 20 Indian tribes were part of the 158th Infantry Regiment known as the Bushmasters from Arizona and New Mexico. What was missing from this article was that the Bushmasters unit was comprised of almost all Mexican-American and Navajo Indians. The Bushmasters belonged to the 158th Regimental Combat Team of the U.S. 6th Army Division of the Arizona National Guard Unit. The newspaper failed to mention the participation of Mexican-Americans as Bushmasters altogether. Not only was the press responsible for making Mexican-American soldiers invisible, but historians are to blame as well. Historians in their books do not completely omit the participation of Mexican-Americans in World War II. They either write a sentence or a paragraph that indicates Mexican-American participation. When historians write about Mexican-Americans during the World War II era, what follows is that World War II was a watershed for Mexican-Americans. They go on to say that once out of war, Mexican-American veterans took advantage of the GI Bill in pursuit of higher education, which led them to demand they no longer be treated like second-class citizens in a country they believed stood for freedom, peace, democracy, and equality for all. While yes, historians do mention that Mexican-Americans received the most Medal of Honors of any ethnicity in World War II, however, the Sleepy Lagoon case and the Zoot Suit riots overshadow it. Upon their return from war, Mexican-American soldiers were once again relegated to their marginalized roles as second-class citizens. Regardless of their contributions and sacrifice, they were still discriminated against by a country they called home. One of the greatest acts of discrimination against a World War II veteran was that of Private Felix Longoria of Three Rivers, Texas. Private Longoria joined the Army on November 11, 1944, and died on June 16, 1945. He was killed in action in the Philippines, and for his service, he earned a Bronze Service Star, a Purple Heart, a Good Conduct Medal, and a Combat Infantryman's Badge. The Three Rivers Funeral Home refused to handle his wake because he was of Mexican descent. Thanks to the intervention of Dr. Hector Garcia and a member of the American GI Forum, Gilbert Caceres, the case of Felix Longoria reached the then Texas State Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, who arranged to have Private Longoria buried with full military honors at the Arlington National Cemetery on February 16, 1949. In conclusion, the participation and contributions of Mexican Americans in World War II was and is undeniable. Their patriotism, heroism, and valor were noted in the number of medals they received. It is therefore a shame that the visible Mexican American and so-called, quote, hoodlum eclipse their memory. It is a shame that most Mexican Americans, as well as Americans of Mexican descent, have no real knowledge of the contribution of Mexican American soldiers to World War II. It is also a shame that in order to gain any real perspective or knowledge, one has to only look to books written by other fellow Mexican Americans. However, even then, the soldier cannot escape his shadow. For most any book about Mexican Americans during the World War II era, the events of the Sleepy Lagoon case and the Zoot Suit riots follow him. While yes, this is part of a history for Mexican Americans here in the United States, it is a shame that these two incidents must always precede the soldier, for it is presented as content and part of an identity, one they will never escape. It is therefore unfortunate that the Mexican Americans will first be known and remembered as participants in the Sleepy Lagoon case and the Zoot Suit riots, and second, as soldiers in World War II.
We have 5 minutes for questions.
I've got a question. What is the second primary source among the volume? It suggests that it's a collection of personal anecdotes or personal works.
Yes, it's actually the only book of its kind. It was published in 1963. Raúl Morín was actually a veteran from World War II. So the book is not only a first story perspective of a Mexican American in the war, but he also incorporates stories of other veterans like that of Private Martinez, and he gave so much detail about that. He talks about, also in the book, about an all Chicano or Mexican American unit, which was known as Company E, one that we don't really hear about in any other books except for his book, and that's where he has a large section in it.
If I could follow up, is it then like a very early sort of oral history? Or is it more him writing about his experiences and what he encountered personally?
It's his experiences, what he encountered, and he talks about other soldiers as well. So he has their names and their stories printed in this. So it's not necessarily like an interview aspect in the book, but it's there where he talks about like what Private Martinez, he didn't interview him, but he wrote about his story, so he included it in his book.
Just I was hoping you could share with people what it was like to use the LA Times historical sort of database to research your project.
It was interesting because I didn't really know what words to use in the very beginning, so that was very hard for me. I had to kind of think back to what were the terms being used for Mexican Americans during this time, because if you put Mexican, just that word, you get an array of information. So I actually found out that I had to use the word just Zoot or maybe Zooter, and then it gave me more information and more articles, and I found so much information from there. And it was, if you read it, just the terminology that they use to describe them, and there's one article in one day where there's 5 different stories, and they're all on the front page or on the inside, and it's constant, either about their hair, their dress, what they were doing, quote unquote, because everybody else they were not presented as a victim in the newspaper. They were actually the ones supposedly causing these riots.
I think it's well, I was thinking it was very interesting you mentioned the LA Times. Are there other newspapers in anticipation of this being expanded? Perhaps other newspapers in Southern California that may have
I did find
written.
them, but I didn't include them. I kind of wanted to stick here. They were reports about, because the zoot suits weren't just worn by Mexican Americans in LA, they were also worn by African Americans, they were by Filipinos. And it wasn't just here, it was also like in Chicago. In the New York Times, they did talk about it just because it was a big event in LA, so it wasn't just, I wanted to take just the Los Angeles take of it. I didn't really there's going to be so much information to also try to include the New York and Chicago and other states, how they were feeling about it.
She just covered my question.
Okay.
No, it's perfect. Thank you.
If I could. Do we know, or do we even have reasonable estimates for how many Mexican Americans actually served in the U.S. military during the war?
I think there are numbers, and all the books talk about different numbers of them, and I think part of it does have to do with if they were classified white, and some of them were Mexican descent, but they just didn't happen to have what you would call a supposed or a common Mexican last name, because they could have, they take their father's last name and their father's happens to be white, and they lose that supposed identity or connection to be Mexican.
Do you anticipate this happening?
If you were to expand this research, what directions would you go in?
I want to, at first I was going to look at, I wanted to originally look at the 3 views, which were the soldier and then the aspect of the zoot suiters, and I wanted to talk about the laborers because Mexican Americans were also involved in the factories building everything, and I wanted to know because they weren't welcomed, but they were welcomed when they needed to work in the factories, and I did want to look at that aspect of it and what they experienced also as well, because you're American and you're trying to serve your country and you do everything that you can, and yet you're still kind of put down to a certain degree, so I did want to include that.
We have time for one more question.
Well, I have 2 more questions. Do you anticipate in further research that you would find a similar situation with Mexican American women who served or who were active in World War II at the same time?
I think so, just because that would be an interesting aspect too, because not only I think that they served, but I think they were also there like as the nurses helping out on the sidelines. So it would be, because I don't really see them also, I guess I would have to look through more books, but I didn't really see enough information to take that right now. I'd probably need more time to look into that route.
Well, do you anticipate looking at, and that's why I started with my first question about Raul Marin, does the perception from the soldiers themselves, do they have this recognition, this realization that their efforts are demeaned and only going to be interpreted in a specific way? Or do you see, because this is what you point out, this situation is very similar for other ethnic groups in World War II. And yet, for some, for some of the Filipino soldiers, for some of the Japanese soldiers, soldiers of Japanese descent, soldiers of Filipino descent, it's still, I'm out there, I'm fighting an American. That's secondary to me. I mean, they were front and foremost in promoting the ideas that they were soldiers first and
Oh yeah, well, when they were in the military, he does talk about how they didn't experience any more, I guess if you want to call it racism within the military. They weren't treated any differently, and they said that it was because they were all there for the same thing and they were helping each other out. They were there for each other, and they were all proud to serve in the military, and they never really talked about discrimination there. It was more or less when they came home,
Right.
just because all of a sudden it's just a shock that when you're there, it's one thing, and when you're out, it's something completely different. Even there was cases when they were back home, even in uniform, they were still not allowed to go in to get their hair cut in certain barbershops because they were Mexican. Even when they were in full military uniform, and it was more like they were just being told, oh, I'm sorry, we're out of the military, there's nothing we can do, it's out of our hands. So they were still, there is a sense of, they were proud of what they did, but they didn't understand, I guess that's why they would say it's a watershed. They didn't understand why they were being treated as such when they did what they did for their country.
All right.